Hi, this is Jdubs and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.
This is what it is, okay? I said empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup. Yeah, I'm not getting any of that. I tried thinking about water and now I'm just thinking about Team Liquid. Drink this, gamer subs. Want to tap your inner Bruce Lee and flow like water? Use my code Thorin, Thorin, for 10% off at gamersubs.gg. Get Right is the greatest Swedish Counter-Strike player of all time. Now, when I was putting together this video, that was my initial starting point, actually. I was starting with the idea that Get Right's the best Swedish CS player across multiple versions of the game, 1.6 and CSGO in this case, because most people obviously said that was Forest. But then I realised, actually, that's an even more enormous statement than even just being the greatest Swedish player, which is basically the best country in the history of CS 1.6 particularly, Counter-Strike in general. I actually realised, wait a minute, people call Forest the GO.A.T because of being good in both CSGO and 1.6. So if I'm saying Get Right is better than Forest in that sense, I'm also saying he's the GO.A.T. I'm saying he's the greatest of all time. Now, I will say, I think Neo is the greatest 1.6 player of all time. And I think I would pick Simple as the greatest CSGO player of all time. I didn't create the logic by which people do the Forest explanation. I'm just pointing out that actually that is what I essentially am implying. Hence, this isn't called Get Right, the greatest Swedish player of all time. But let's start there, because just saying you're the greatest Swedish Counter-Strike player of all time is an enormous statement. Swedish Counter-Strike still is historically the most successful and decorated in the history of the franchise. From the early 2000s until basically late 2019 with the Fnatic team, they were among the best in the world. They were winning championships. There were elite teams coming from this country, many top players. So if you're the best Swedish player, you were typically, especially in 1.6, maybe the best player in the world. I mean, you think of some of the names that fit that bill. Heaton early on, Potty. I wouldn't even say he's his sidekick. I actually thought he was the better player. Hyper was a phenomenal player if you go back to 2004. Spawn, obviously in his SK days, a monster. Zet, when he was playing particularly for NIP, was arguably the best player in the world. As I always say, he was Forest the year before Forest was. And then along came Forest. Yes, Forest was an unbelievable player. Certainly a contender for greatest of all time in 1.6. At the end of 1.6, I had an article about this, I'll link it as usual in the description box. I had, out of the Swedish players, I had Forest number 1, I had Potty number 2. Now, in terms of the greatest 1.6 players ever, I actually had Forest at number 2, and then Potty at number 3, because I had Neo number 1. I'd still think that to this day. Then CSGO happened. Now, Forest was a very strong player in the first couple of years. One of the best, especially the first year or so of the game. But, and this is the issue for me, he began to drop off over the next few years. But to me, it's his style of play and how exciting his peaks were that was so appealing to fans, me included. Who the fuck doesn't like to watch Forest go off? And the fact that his role, typically the second into a site, is basically, in theory, the most frag heavy. Can obviously have some very good lurkers, as we're going to discuss now. So I always thought he kind of got a pass, because when he had that big game, or he had in a crazy round, it just looked so flashy. He passed the eye test immediately. It scored a 10 out of 10 on the eye test. So people didn't necessarily mind if you didn't win the key clutch you were in, or you didn't actually outperform the other star of the other map, or you didn't win the game, or win the tournament for that matter. In fact, as I've alluded to before, most people call, in fact many people I would say, a lot of people on Reddit particularly, call Forest the greatest of all time, the GO.A.T of all CS, on the basis that it was sort of decent until, I'd say personally, about, let's say, like reasonably, I'd say maybe end of 2018. It was definitely diminishing returns those years. But let's say around that time, he was still like the 25th best player in the world at times, or at least in their mind. I never thought it was quite added up. I think people were kind of just like waiting for the great moments and then ignoring the bad ones. As they tend to do with great players in any sport or discipline when they're towards the end and you just want to see some more greatness. You just enjoy watching them play, don't you? So to me, the interesting thing is, though, I actually think Get Right's case, hence this video, is stronger overall in terms of that context of over both games. So let's start. Get Right, effectively, when we're talking about chance to be the greatest of all time, we're not just taking like years where, in his case, he was playing for the 4th or 5th best Swedish team or semi-pro teams, in the same way as I'm not, quite frankly, in terms of the greatest of all time. You don't just get to become it like Forest if you just play forever and you're just okay later on in your career. We're talking about peak years, where in those years you're extremely good, and then maybe when you're marginally outside of that. So for me, with Get Right, from 2009 to 2012, in terms of 2012, we're talking about, let's say, like just around like the end of the first quarter of the year, because after that they switched over to CSGO, and obviously then they went and were one of the early adopters and pioneers in that regard. But you add in, obviously for CSGO, you'd certainly say 2012, he was one of the very best 1.6 players, arguably the best over this time span. I'm not talking best players, not just Swedish players. And he was especially aggregated, in my opinion, over these games, year, before you go to CSGO. I think he was actually the best over that time span. Like, for my money, if we're talking about this period, in 2009 and 2012, the people closer than Forrest, I don't think Forrest's even the main contender at that point. His years were before that where he was a monster. It's Neo and Marklov who were closer to Forrest over that part of the period of 1.6 in this discussion. Forrest was a lot more spotty in terms of his motivation, which had the knock-on effect of his consistency, and his individual excellence, I would say, beyond 2009. I think he was still very good in 2009 at times. It just wasn't as good as these amazing names I'm talking about before. And 1.6 was a very individual game in terms of what a star player could do. Like people like Ziwu, although he's only done it for a year on LAN, Simple particularly, maybe Nico at times, they've done unbelievable things in terms of consistency in the game. In 1.6, the truly great players were kind of doing Simple type things for stretches of months at a time, years at a time. That's the level that Neo, earlier on Forrest, Marklov, particularly Get Right, these could all do this, etc. And I will say, Forrest was from 2006 to 2008, you want to give him that 3-year span, he was unbelievable. He had times where he was very, very, very strong, and obviously we'll get into the contrast. Then if you come to CSGO for Get Right, so we're talking like latter half or so of 2012 to, I would say, he still held on for me until sort of the last 3 quarters of 2014 maybe. I thought he was the best player in CSGO. I think if you go look at the number of MVPs over that time span, it would add up to it. He was the one getting all the rankings and the lists. Most people acknowledge he was the best player in the world. And he played on a team with Forrest, who I've just said earlier was extremely good at this point in time. There were other players around this time that were extremely good too in contention. ochs had his brief bursts to be a rival or maybe overtake him. Kenny S was very good but hadn't quite hit his peak and was obviously kicked out of the main French team. What made Get Right so unbelievable in CSGO was he was winning clutches at an absurd rate. People probably know that famous stat where at one point in time, in 1v2s, he was winning more than 50% of them. That's just impossible, by the way, at the top level of Counter-Strike. Lurking, he basically revolutionized being like the best player in the world from hard lurk, where you're coming in behind all the time. You're always in a position where like you're using off angles, you're using timing pushes on them, you're punishing them if they try to rotate off. Fragging wise, he was putting up the biggest numbers, even over Forrest. Consistency, there was like a year where he just never had a bad tournament seemingly. His killer instinct was nuts, hence the clutch wins, hence the MVPs, hence dominating the finals. He had an amazing drive. I think there's very few players have ever come close to his drive. I would say you're talking people like Device, maybe you got to throw in Elige. I've heard Nico actually had very good work ethic, called Zyrathenia at certain points in time. Unbelievable, and as a result, along with the drive to win, the work ethic goes hand in hand with that. If you really, really want to win, you put in the fucking work. You don't become the best just off skill. You become the best from skill on the platform of all the preparation and work is done. And that's why you know you're the best you can possibly be. Then you look beyond that. I would say like 2015 to 2016, he was a good but not quite elite player. I thought Forrest's level was kind of similar, but he just had the different playing style. So if you like that sort of like crisp aim, it's going to just pop a little bit more. I think 2017 to 2020, there was an obvious decline, but it was gradual, sort of year on year or every 6 months or so. And really, realistically, like, yeah, that period is just irrelevant to this discussion. If we want to talk about Forrest, look, let's be real. He was super sick in his early 1.6 career. Always had a rival who certain people would debate was better. In his CSGO career, he was super sick early on, but then it's kind of flashes beyond that. So the thing we get right is, I know people are going to think, well, the eye test, because I consider the eye test the start of where you have these discussions about how good a player is. Listen, Forest wins the eye test in terms of the flash, in terms of what their peak player looks like. But obviously, you have to consider in the eye test as well, like, keep watching the matches, right? So then when Forest has an average game, well, he doesn't get to win on that one, right? So I would say, in terms of the flash of the eye test, the mechanical ability, yeah, Forest wins that one. Get.Right's game, though, in my opinion, was clearly more polished than Forest. Forest had a higher skill level and could hit the higher skill ceiling, but Get.Right could, like, sort of be an 8 out of 10 every game, it felt like. And he had a lot of games he was 9 out of 10. He maybe didn't have the 10 out of 10 gear in 1.6. He did in early CSGO, though. He was unbelievable. I actually think he'd be a contender for best sprayer of all time in Counter-Strike, in particularly 1.6. Like, watch the Athid frag movie that he made of him if you want to see how mad this guy's skills are. Very, very skilled player. It's just, when you compare him to Forest in 1.6 or Simple in CSGO, now you're just making it unfair. Among the mortals, he was unbelievably skilled. So I would say it's comparable to, you know, what Devices in CSGO. He's a very sick player. It's just that there's certain people where they're just absurd at that one area, right? I'd also say as well, if we're talking about eye test, how about eye test in the big games? Because Get.Right is one of the great money players of all time. When you're in a final, when you've got a win a big semi over your rival, he's going to turn up. He's going to go fucking ham against pretty much all the great teams of his era. The Pauls, Na'Vi, MTW, whoever it might be, he is going to deliver. That was not always the case for Forest. In fact, Forest tended to be a little bit pedestrian in some of the finals, especially in these latter years. And that's actually why Forest was in a position where he won far less majors, even with favourites in terms of the final, than Neo, who often was an underdog in the finals. Now, in terms of the individual level of play, at his peak, I think, in a sense, Get.Right was more scary than Forest, but it's an unorthodox sense. Because Forest is scary because he can explode, knock you out, like, think about, like, Conor McGregor or peak Anderson Silva in MMA. It's the idea that out of nowhere it can happen. That's terrifying, right? It's the intimidation of the unknown factor. What's scary about Get.Right, and it's similar to Neo in this regard, is he's just relentless. Like, he seems to play his game at his pace, the way he wants to, no matter what you do. You don't know where he is. You know he'll consistently perform. You know he'll get his numbers. He's going to pick away at your confidence. He's going to win clutches against you. You'll never have that feeling of safety at any point in the round. I'd say in that sense, there's a good comparison in the MMA vein if we're keeping going with that. I'd say he's more like Habib. He's someone who just grinds you down and you lose because eventually you just give up. You just gas. You just think, this guy never fucking get tired. Do I ever get a moment to breathe? You don't. That's the thing with Get.Right. So in my opinion, Get.Right was literally the best player at certain points in 1.6, the latter years. And in my opinion, in CSGO, he was the best player in the world first couple of years. I only have Forest as the best player in the world. I would say probably like 2008. And it's debatable in 2007. 2006, most people say Zet. 2009, I thought that was when Get.Right and him were kind of going head-to-head for that, and I thought Get.Right had more of the performances, greater frequency, even if Forest still had those insane peaks at times. At majors, I've kind of alluded to it before, Forest wouldn't be his absolute best. It's not like he was bad, by the way. He wasn't just like tanking these games. He was just kind of okay or good. Get.Right, listen, there's a reason why Na'Vi didn't win 5 majors in a row, despite making 5 major finals in a row in 1.6. Get.Right took care of them in the ESWC final. He was the hero. In terms of longevity, obviously a massive factor here. We're talking longevity of high-level performance. So I'm talking, in this regard, let's say number of years as legit best player in the world contender. We'll say contender to make it like a bit more of an interesting debate, right? So I'd say Forest reasonably has 5. And remember, we're counting both versions of the game. He's got 2006. I personally think he was still in contention. Actually, some of his teammates think I can't remember. Some of them think he was good in 2006. Others say 2007 was the best year. 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009. And then I give him 2013. Because 2013, yeah, he was unbelievable. I think Get.Right has 6 years where he's the best or contender for best. He's got 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014. By the way, did you notice how nuts that is? Over 2 different games played back-to-back, he has 6 years in a row as either the best or contender, like shortlist, talking like Ballon d'Or shortlist, of best player in the entire world. Beyond that, they're both good, but they're not elite players mostly, before and after. The whole nonsense about longevity just being how long you play, That's whack. It just doesn't work. Not least because, by the way, it really fuck up certain sports like hockey, if you think about it. In my opinion, it's about your peak years and what you can put together with that body of work. In terms of the team dynamics, Get.Right was a more reliable carry for your team. Think of the contrast in CSGO, maybe this will help for people who watched it, like, say, the last 4 or 5 years, between when Magisk is at his peak and when Config is at his peak. Listen, Config's going to tear people up and have the best aim in the game. But you know what? Magisk is just going to be a more well-rounded player, a more consistent player. He can even win your games when he's actually not having the massive frags or he's behind in a game, etc. With some of the things he can do on the map. So, listen, if we want to talk about more skilled, Config wins. If we want to talk about better all-round player, I'd probably have said Magisk. I think the fact that he closes games out, that's a real tough aspect to beat. That's a really difficult one. He's even a tough competitor. This is a guy where people know in CSGO, he had all these problems like basically with his digestive system that would cause him actual pain when he was under stress in matches. You wouldn't know it because he was still winning some of those tournaments. He would still put his numbers up. And by the way, quite frankly, he didn't particularly complain. He just fucking went about his business, kind of like Device has in CSGO with a similar issue later on. Forrest is obviously playing a hard role, but I don't think it's key in the same way. Just as I always used to explain that if you were Fur during 2017 SK Gaming, you were sort of shit out of luck, mate. Because if you play phenomenally, Cold Zero, like the Get.Right in this case, always plays well. So unfortunately, he's going to win the MVP because his game also looks more all-round, feels like it has a bit more impact. Even though you'll have an insane impact opening the rounds up or causing mayhem on the map. It's just, again, preference. Just your own bias. In this case, I was biased to Cold Zero. In this case, I'm biased towards Get.Right. In terms of accomplishments, Get.Right has won 1 major less than Forrest over their careers. He's won 3 to Forrest's 4 because he obviously didn't play with Fnatic for those years that Forrest did. But quite frankly, I think it's not fair to just say how many majors you won. Because the question in this case is, were you the man at those majors? Not just did you win a major, right? Like, it's not like Dossier winning a PGL Krakow puts him in the conversation over simple, does it? For GO.A.T of CSGO. So for me, Get.Right was the best player on the majors they won. So that's the 2009 one at IEM. That's going to be, let me think, he's won 3. So then obviously ESWC 2011, the MVP for my money. And then ESL1 Cologne, again, MVP for my money. I thought actually he was unbelievable at that tournament. I know some people go Freiburg because it was like relative to his role, he overperformed, etc. So in both versions, in my opinion, they should count more for him than Forrest's does. Okay, maybe Forrest gets it for CPL Winter 2006. That was a year he was extremely good. I can't check the stats on that. Off the top of my head, he was an extremely good player, though. He can have that one. If you combine 1.6 and CSGO, I give Get.Right the edge over Forrest. In a world where Forrest had Get.Right's mentality, yeah, I think he wins in that case. But that's basically the Kobe versus Shaq debate from the the middle part of Shaq's career and the early part of Kobe's career. Yeah, if Shaq had Kobe's mentality, he'd probably be the best player to ever play basketball. It'd be like between him and Michael Jordan and Wilt Chamberlain and the super sick players, right? Problem is, just as Shaq didn't do that work, neither did Forrest necessarily, or wasn't as driven. So what happened is all that happened. We could have great fun hypotheticals, but what happened is what happened. So Get.Right, by the way, if you want hypotheticals, mate, I always said he could have been unbelievable and just been the GO.A.T 1.6 maybe. If there'd been some more years of 1.6, that was how good he was at the end. Then again, though, if we get more years of 1.6 with Get.Right, maybe we don't get those early CSGO years. So maybe in the end it swings around abouts, right? 6 and 2 threes, as we say in England. So as a result, yeah, I'll bring it right back to the beginning. Get.Right is the greatest of all time over the Counter-Strike franchise. He was already, in my opinion, potentially the GOAT in CSGO. I think you have to look at what he accomplished and how good he was relative to his peers. And he has to be in the conversation, even if I pick simple. And he had a shot to be the best in 1.6 and was certainly extremely good player, a top 10 player of all time. So yeah, Get.Right is the greatest. This video was kindly supported by Eddie, Kris with a K, Lager15, Pronogo, Shenlong, Zachary Carter, Adam Ochs, Alexander Rao, Andreas Kroknes, Animosity, Dean Tanglis, ErikHillestad, Hades, Jdubs, Jensen Goh, Joseph Ginsburg, Kovacevicd, Tobias Bernasconi, Zoomba, Zyrathenia, and as always, special thanks going out to my boy Jerky's Minion. Want to suggest topics or guests for my shows? Want to ask me questions in my monthly AMA? Do you want teasers? Who are the upcoming guests? Maybe you want to be part of one of those discussions I do where we nerd out. Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrolluminati today by using the Patreon link in the description box below.